Money anymore. We're going to move now from, I suppose, the industry regulation side to more of a practical application of this regulatory framework and legislation. A case study courtesy of South 32. We're focusing now on getting it right when it comes to critical control. So a real world example that will hopefully, for us here this morning, offer valuable takeaways on effective implementation and leadership. To lead us through this one, Julius Thomas, General Manager at Worsley Alumina, South 32, a seasoned operations and engineering executive who comes with over 25 years of experience spanning alumina refining, aluminium smelting, also worked in explosives manufacturing and military engineering across different geographical and cultural locations, and currently leads a pretty complex operation with about 1,000 personnel across the refinery and port operations. So would you please welcome Julius up to the stage.
This room, when you walk into it, I have to start off by saying is that, it's a very confronting room because you have a lot of experience in the room, and then you get asked to speak on a particular topic, and the words are, and it was a request from my Aaron Graham, is how to get it right, and I stand up here wondering, when I speak about how I get it right, what could the expectation be, and let me start off by actually dropping two bombshells. The chances are very unlikely that I'm going to tell you something different, vastly different to what you already know. The other thing is, I'm going to attempt to play a video. Given our technical difficulties early in the morning, I don't know how successful I'll be, but I'm going to try that. But what I wanted to do before we get into the presentation per se is just maybe share a few comments, right? We are very fortunate in that we get to work with Aaron's team. And in developing what you'll see, it will be a combination of work South 32 has done, and I've got some really smart people with me here this morning from South 32, so I'm just presenting a reflection of their work. But, and I'm sure we've used this analogy many, many times. It's like a marriage, right? There've been times, and where's Gary? Gary's in the room somewhere, I assume, yeah. We've had our differences with Gary around things, but what I want to walk away, or what I would want you to walk away from this is, I'm not going to give you the theoretical part of how to do this. I'm going to give you the operational part of what happens in our operation on a week by week, day by day, when we have conversations with the regulator, when we're unsure about, what should a MSMS look like, what should our principal mining hazard management plan look like, this is what we do, why must we change it, etc., etc. But the point I want to leave you with is this, is that the more conversations you have, the more discussion, the more problem solving you have in a less way of who's right, I think the opportunity to advance safety is always there. And so what we will share is what we have done. By no means am I telling you that this is the only way to do it. I'm just giving you an insight into what we, or how we approach that critical controls. And I'll speak to it in terms of, work management, because many of you know that if we did nothing, we'd probably be safe. If we all, didn't get up in the morning and drive up here, there'd be no chance of us being in an accident, etc. So there'll be a heavy focus on how you manage work, how you think about work, how do you think about risk, what are the things that are more important than other things? Because everything's important, but there's a reason that words matter, because we don't just call it controls, we call it critical controls, because those are the ones you want to be fanatical about. Those are the ones that, you never want an opportunity to either find them not in use or not effective. So that'll be a little bit about that. But what I also wanted to share, for those that may not be aware of what an alumina or a mining operation that, supplies bauxite ore that's refined and eventually shipped, what it looks like, that's the video that I'll attempt to play. And that video was put together by one of our technicians, and it gives an overview of, what are the hazards that we see in our operation. So when we speak to some of the numbers, it'll give you some context. And I think you would have heard it from many, many people that actually said, whatever you're going to do has to fit your operation. So what we're going to share with you is what we did to fit our operation. So I'll go to the next slide, and hopefully everything works. Right, so that's a nice nighttime picture of the refinery, and we'll show a little bit more. I'm not going to do that because we had a fantastic welcome to country earlier. I'm hoping if I click it next, the video will play. It does. Right, breathe a sigh of relief after that. So what I wanted to share is this is a high-level overview of what we're going to talk about in 3 slides that show a little bit more detail. I'm not going to talk to each of those blocks. I'm not going to insult you by assuming you cannot read, so I'll leave that with you. But the words that we picked are specific, because when we speak about compliance, there's a regulatory piece, but there's also an internal South 32 piece, and what we've distilled that to is what we call our safety guarantee. And what it basically says is that we all guarantee that everyone will go home safe and well every day. Now, when you have a look at that word guarantee, if I had to ask you today, can you guarantee that everyone will go home, safe and well? It's a hard conversation because, well, most people that we asked that question to said, well, I can guarantee myself, but I can't guarantee those other people because I don't know what they do. But that is what we wanted our people to believe, that it is possible to do that. And it's possible because you have to ensure that you have a system that can guarantee the outcome of work by ensuring the critical controls you have that you put in place are actually suitable and effective. Because if you cannot, then the question should be asked, why can't you? Because that will then prompt you, what can you do? So when you have a look at what the regulator wants us to do from a mine safety management system, it's exactly the same thing. So what we didn't try to do when we approached implementation was to try and introduce it as something different. We tried to introduce it as something as, this is how we work. So that allowed our people not to have a culture shock about some massive change, but to do minor tweaks along the way that allowed the intent to be met. And I think that's one thing I'd like to recognize from the regulator, is that they allowed us the opportunity to meet the intent and to be less prescriptive in terms of what we had to do. That being said, there were some criteria that we had to meet, and we had to go through some verification activities with them, but eventually that's where we landed. So when you have a look from the first part, the development phase, is that where we started. We had to put this thing together, just by a rough guess. When you looked at that video, how many principal mining hazards do you think that operation would have? Pick a number.
34.
Yes, that's a pretty good number. Christy McGurr, who's our health and safety training manager, is here. Christy, what's the number? Because it's up on the screen. Yeah, but that's how many we documented. Now, in the past, did we have it? Yes, it existed in various pieces of documents all over. So we put it all together and we ended up with one document that gave us the playbook with how we would manage that. Then when we got to the implementation phase, the question is, well, now you have all this information. We heard from Dwayne a little bit earlier around data and what do you do with it and how do you handle it, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll move away from that one. So for us that manage work, and I have never been in any other role except an operational role. You get familiar with things, you get used to how things are done, and you make certain assumptions. And when we started to implement this thing, we realized that some of our assumptions were not they were not what we thought they would be, and that was because when we speak to the frontline teams, there's a belief that we have around how work gets done and how work actually gets done, and we'll speak a little bit about that when we speak about verification activities. Compliance, you can put any system you want in place, and you can have the paperwork to back it. You can have various things, but until you have sufficient data that gives you an indication that your system is actually working, what you have is a false sense of an economy that you believe is going to work. So we've spent a lot of time having that conversation, and I know there'll be different views in the room around how many observations are enough, how much is too little, how many should I do, who should do it, what should we do with it after we do it, and then we'll share a little bit about that. So that's the flavor of the next 3 slides. It's more around a little bit about the how. So I'm going to move on to that one, and again, right? So you'll see there's a bow tie up there. We heard from Christian earlier around bow ties and what they do, and one of the things that I think that I wanted to actually share is that the bow tie is just a methodology. It's just a tool, and for us, the bow tie was an opportunity to provide a basis of identifying what the right critical controls are, and what are some of the things you want to have around a critical control, right? So you want them to be clear. We heard that before. If people don't know what it is, the chances of them implementing it is not going to be there. It has to be purposeful. It has to meet what you wanted it to do. It has to be consistent. And for those that have been familiar with Sean Brady, etc., you would have heard this before, that hazards don't kill people. The absence of controls do. So when you put them in place, you almost have to guarantee they're there. Now, nobody comes to work wanting to get hurt. People make decisions in the course of the day, either because of the circumstance, their background, the environment at work, etc. So that allowed us to arrive at, well, what are these critical controls and what should they look like? How should we measure them? How often should we check them, etc. Then for a operation like Worsley, you have a mine, you have a refinery, and a port operation. They all do different things. They have a different, what we call, risk profile. So what we then did is we did a bottom-up build from an activity level, right? And that, when we had this conversation, it was like, no, we're never going to be able to do this. It's too hard. There's too many things. We don't know what everyone does. But the other thing I'll say is that you have to be willing to invest money and time. It's not a cheap exercise. As a learning, that's what I'll share with you as well, is that when we looked at all the activity that we do, and then we identify for these activities, what principal mining hazards do they bring into the workplace? And for the purposes of this conversation, let's call it a fatal risk activity, right? So if I'm changing a spool up in a rack, I have to get up there. So it introduces a working at height risk. So we did all of that for maintenance. We did that for production activities, and then we basically mapped it. So we could then identify for every team what their risk profile was. So if you take a maintenance team that, let's say, works in the digestion area of our plant, that's doing pump, spool change out, valve change out, they're going to find themselves in a situation where hazardous chemicals are something they're going to have to deal with. Isolations are something they're going to have to deal with. They're going to have to do lifting operations. They're going to have to do working heights. Then it allows you then to start to focus, well, what does that team need, and what is it that they need to be proficient on over and above everything else? Because training that team on what are the critical controls for drowning or lack or prevention of drowning may not add the value that it would had if we train them on embedding the controls for working at heights or hazardous chemicals, etc. So that's why understanding your risk profile, albeit a hard thing to do, is actually very valuable as you then set up your safe system of work. So if you're going to go down that path, be prepared for that. It will take a lot of time, especially from engineers, planners, coordinators, supervisors, because some of your work plans you may find haven't documented everything that you expect them to do. Now, when you pull that together, you have a risk profile for a team that is run by a supervisor. And I'll just speak a little bit around expectations for Schedule 26. So part of the Schedule 26 accountability is that the individual is familiar with the hazards and controls for the work that's being done. They visit the site where the work is being performed. People are trained and competent to do the work that they're supposed to do. They have the tools and equipment to perform that work. What this does now, it allows the supervisor to make sure that he can demonstrate that he's competent to supervise and be in control of that area, because he understands all the risk profiles as opposed to the 33 or 32 principal mining hazards across the entire operation. So it does allow you to be a bit more focused and less generalistic in terms of how you manage the critical control identification and ensuring that people are competent to actually perform in that role. Yeah, so the next one is on work design, right? So I'm sure many of you in the room run an ERP system, yeah? We run OneSAP. Important for us to actually recognize that OneSAP is more than an ERP system in terms of how we can use it. So we started to use OneSAP as part of our safety management system. And what are some of the ways that we did this? We heard a little bit earlier when we spoke about what good looks like, is that if you can identify the fatal risk activity in the planning phase, then the opportunity to consider how to engineer that out exists there. So from a work design point of view, that basically starts with how we think about work, and it gets wired down, right down to KPIs for engineers. So engineers, who are primarily the designers of work together with maintenance folk, they have a requirement to reduce fatal risk activity on a year-on-year basis. So if a task was done or if a task was done because we had to erect a scaffold, and when they look at that work over, let's say, a period of a year, that work is being executed more than 8 times, or whatever the number your organization may choose, our expectation is that there would be an engineering request to get a permanent platform put in. Or if there's a valve that sits, up in a rack, and we have to service that valve X amount of time, our expectation is that there will be something done that the valve then comes to a working height or a platform be built. So what we are always trying to do is to reduce the exposure and hence the frequency. So that's something we try to look at in the work design part. In the work planning space, so it's gone through one set of professionals, and then it gets to the next set, and planning for us has become more than just when am I going to do the work. Planning has become, well, as a planner now, I've got this, whether it be a planned task or an unplanned task, that an engineer or a person has scoped out for me. What am I going to do with it? And that's maybe something that we can also share, is that having people with the right competency in your planning role and seeing them less as administrators and users of just SAP is an opportunity for you to find another way to actually consider engineering out an exposure to a fatal risk task. Because most of our planners are ex-tradespeople that have worked in the field, that have been operators, that understand, well, if I put that scaffold there, it's going to block that pump that I need to do a changeover later on, which will mean I'll have to climb over that scaffold, et cetera, et cetera. So the better you can position work prior to the execution day, the less likely you are of having any of your workers in an opportunity where they could injure themselves. So what we do in SAP as well, we document the work operation, and we use various acronyms, and I'm sure each organization has their own acronym. So we have an acronym that we call FRW, fatal risk work. So that operation will say fatal risk work, working at heights. So what it does is, when a supervisor comes onto shift, so let's say it's his first shift back, right? If he goes onto his AIM screen, he will be able to see all the work that is sitting in SAP that's got a fatal risk work acronym attached to it. So what it does is it gives him an exposure for the day. So he understands on the day, like in the morning, what are those activities that I need to be across, right? Because as a supervisor, there's many things that are going to be happening in the day. But for those activities that have got a fatal risk work attachment to it, our expectation that a form of leadership verifies the work before it starts. And that's another part that we'll share with you, that there's many conversations that we have around, doing stop for work or safety pause, etc. And those things are good and they have a time and place. But what we've been trying to work with our teams on is that we only start when safe. And what we've defined that is, well, what does start when safe mean? It means that the controls must be in place, effective and verified before the work starts. Now, again, what I'll say is that, me saying that doesn't mean that we do that 100% of the time, or we found that to be done 100% of the time. We have gaps. We have found times where a barricade hasn't been in place, and the work group has decided to continue. So these are all, learnings that you'll find, and I share that with you because even when it goes wrong, my advice is don't stop, because we tend to have a reaction to things. This is not working, after a week, let's try something else. We took about probably a year to start to get it embedded into SAP, where everybody understood what it meant when they saw a fatal risk acronym, what were the expectations that we actually set for them. And then it also allowed the supervisors to actually meet their intent of a Schedule 26 supervisor by being able to demonstrate to the regulator, well, on my last block, I verified 10 of these activities. I conducted maybe 4 workplace interactions, and there's the evidence of that's what I've done. So it's removed this angst that supervisors have around, how do I show that I've done these things? Because the other option is you give them an additional task. Write down everything that you do so we can have a conversation on it. But if you wire it into the system of work, it doesn't become an additional thing. It becomes this is how we work. One of the things we also do is that, we do major shuts, and for those people that are, are familiar with that word, is where we take down large pieces of kit and we try to do refurbishments, improvements, etc. The one thing that we have been very hard on that team as an outcome is that when the major shut is done, our expectation is that you have helped the maintenance teams that will come and service that equipment going forward with a reduction of fatal risk exposures, right? And that then allows the frequency of verification of critical controls that are needed to become less. The last one that I'll share is that what do you do with all of this? So now we've put all these systems in place. We've told people, listen, this is what we expect you to do. This is how we expect you to do it, etc. And that comes from the work that we spoke initially about. Principal Mising has management plans and making sure that you have a performance standard that you can articulate is clear and measurable, right? It can't be that go and look and see if it's fine. It has to be, for it to be fine, this has to be there, either a measurement, a check, a confirmation. Now, the one part that we wanted to move away from, and I think there was some conversation earlier, is that we have our supervisors, then we have our superintendents, we have managers, and we have a few other people that sit there. Primarily, the space we want our supervisors to work on is the day-to-day, so what we call workplace interactions, right? And that workplace interaction ask is based on the risk profile for the area. So if you remember earlier, what I said is each area has got a particular risk profile. The workplace interaction schedule will match that risk profile. So if you have an exposure to lifting operations, your workplace interaction profile will actually drive that. So that allows you then to match your interaction and verification system with your risk exposure profile. Now, then we have superintendents. Our superintendents do what we call CMAs, control management activities. That then looks at the system. We have, let's say, we did 120 workplace interactions on working at heights. The superintendent will actually look at the 120 and say, well, I see a common theme happening here with that particular crane company, for example. So that allows us then to fix the systemic issues that are less in the field of the everyday, but more in the work of the system. Also allows us to have a good look on, do we have the right controls? Because if you have a control that is always failing, but you haven't considered your risks to be seriously requiring work, then I would argue that we've obviously defined the critical control as being something that's incorrect. Now, we have a matrix that defines it, like you've seen many people show examples of. And maybe a good example to share here, right? So I'm sure many of you have the exposure of falling from heights, and we have many controls, and I'll share some of them. Some of them around, training, some of them around making sure that the individual is, fit to work at heights, etc. But if I had to ask you, what would be the one thing that you would expect someone above all those other things being controlled, but the one thing you want is the person to be hooked on, right? So if they're not trained but they're hooked on, chances are they're not going to die. If they're hooked on and their training expired last month, well, chances are they're not going to die. But if their training is concurrent, they're fit for work, but they're not hooked on and they fall, chances are likely they're going to die or become seriously hurt. So there are things that you have to be fanatical over. And I'm not saying don't worry about the other things. Please don't take that to be the message that I'm giving you. But what I'm saying is that there are things that you have to be dying the ditch over. And there's others that you have to work on improving the system. So we've tried to have that conversation with our teams in identifying critical controls versus just what is a good control. And there was a conversation earlier around how many interactions or how many observations is enough. On one of the slides, you would have seen that we do 43,000 PL4, or what we call fatal risk work activities every year. So that's the exposure that we manage. And for that, we have a large number of observations. And very similar to yourselves, I get asked by people that work in my team is that, why do we have to do 4 observations a block? Why can't it be 2 or why can't it be 1? The number can be anything. What you have to be able to answer for yourself, does it give me enough confidence for the risk profile that I'm managing? So for 43,000 a year, we've determined the number to be 4. So that's a brief overview of, I hope you got something out of it. I try not to focus too much on the slides. I'll let you read through that, but just wanted to share a little bit around the work that we've done. Thank you.